We welcome you today to the Air University Library's Faculty Roundtable and Publication Series presentation, An Honorable Place in American Air Power, Civil Air Patrol at 80. We're very honored today to have our guest speaker, Dr. Frank Lovitch Jr. And Dr. Lovitch is a native of North Carolina. He's currently the curator of the Modern Military History at the Smithsonian Institute, National Museum of American History. He's a veteran of the U.S. Air Force, and he's had numerous publications to his credit. His first edited book was Baton Survivor, a POW's account of Japanese captivity in World War II. He's published in many periodicals, including the Journal of Military History, Naval War College Review, the Northern Mariner, North Carolina Historical Review, Army History, Naval History, Air Power History, Marine Corps History, War on the Rocks, Volunteer Magazine, the Center for International Maritime History, the Sextant, CB Magazine Online, the Smithsonian Magazine Online, and the Washington Post. He's currently the Mid-Atlantic Regional Coordinator for the Society of Military History and he's the National Historian of the Civil Air Patrol. As a colonel in the Civil Air Patrol, Dr. Blazich has previously served his organization as their National Historian and as a director of the Colonel Louisa S. Moore Center for CAP History. Dr. Blazich, we are very honored to have you, and I'll turn it over to you, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Jeff, thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm sorry, everyone, I can't join you today down in Alabama, but I'm coming to you from somewhat sunny Washington, D.C. I have to first pause and note that this presentation, and particularly the book it is based on, are due in large part to a large number of men and women at Air University, particularly Air University Press and Air University Library. So I have to thank Mr. Jeff Simpson. I'd like to thank Dr. Chris Ryan, Dr. Ali Mehmed, Dr. Stephanie Rollins, Daniel Armstrong, Megan Cohn, Nidra Looney, and notably my editor, Ms. Donna Bajenska, whose patience knows no bounds, particularly working with me. So Donna, I know you're tuning into this, a large thank you. And lastly, Dr. Margaret Sankey, who's a friend from the Society for Military History. And it was actually Dr. Sankey who pointed out, he said, why not publish with our university press? And I'm grateful to have had the opportunity and grateful for all of y'all tuning in today. So you can get these slides to work. There we go. On January 28, 1943, Congressman Hatton W. Sumner of Texas spoke candidly before the House of Representatives about a group of volunteer civilian aviators whose services to the nation were then little known. His quote, "Interest was aroused in this organization because of its demonstrated unselfish, self-reliant willingness to do something about it, fit to live and govern in a free democracy sort of spirit." Responding to Sumner's comments, Congressman John M. Voorhees of Ohio, seen here on the left, noted how he himself flew active duty anti-submarine patrol with this civilian organization during the summer 1942 recess. Voorhees praised their collective spirit of, quote, self-reliance and resourcefulness, although in performing their flying missions, their discipline and obedience meet military standards. These were the men and women of the Civil Air Patrol. Between the Office of Civilian Defense and the War Department, the movement to militarize the civilian aviation community of CAP into a fourth arm of the nation's defense would unfold over the first half of 1942. For 18 months, from 1942 to 1943, these CAP civilian volunteers flying armed, light, privately owned aircraft operated an anti-submarine coastal patrol operation as part of the American military effort in the Battle of the Atlantic. This effort represented a pre-war possibility termed wartime exigency, a product of multiple individuals bound by the idea that light aircraft and private citizens could serve a national defense purpose. In the context of this grand experiment, CAP became the first American civilians to actively engage enemy forces in defense of the United States, proving the worth of auxiliary air services. Now, CAP's Coastal Patrol Initiative developed from a critical need to stem the tide of German submarine operations, inflicting heavy losses on coastal shipping. Begun as a sub-experiment by the Army Air Forces in March 1942, CAP's effort commenced with meager resources and no practical experience in anti-submarine warfare. Senior Navy leaders cast a wary gaze upon the civilian undertaking and considered the entire endeavor to be problematic. But within weeks of operation, CAP's small effort demonstrated the discipline and military bearing desired by the armed forces. The Army embraced the CAP Coastal Patrol, and it eventually won over the Navy to boost the coastal anti-submarine deterrent and aerial convoy escort. Following the discontinuance of CAP Coastal Patrol operations in late August 1943, the entire story has faded from national memory. Not CAP memory, I would note. Scholars have oftentimes ignored the CAP contribution in the Battle of the Atlantic as little more than a sideshow warranting a sentence or perhaps at best a paragraph. Even within CAP, the Coastal Patrol story is at times misunderstood or misinterpreted. But I have to pause for a minute and say, but wait a minute, CAP is still here. And today we're celebrating 80 years of service to local communities, to the cities, states, and the nation. This talk then is twofold. Drawing from previously unpublished, unavailable archival material, it'll frame the CAP Coastal Patrol effort in relation to the Army and Navy's domestic anti-submarine operations from 42 to 43. And it's also going to frame why the Coastal Patrol effort was so critical to CAP's enduring service to America then and now. CAP's overall origins trace back to 1936, when Gilrob Wilson, seen here on the left, a veteran aviator from World War I, a director of the New Jersey Department of Aviation, and a former member of the 119th Observation Squadron of the State Air National Guard, spent a month in the Third Reich studying German air development. He came away convinced that a future conflict was inevitable, and Wilson returned to the United States and began to flesh out an idea to use civilian pilots ineligible for military service for defensive purposes in their respective state or local community. Wilson in turn wrote to the American Red Cross, and he proposed an auxiliary aviation corps which could transport medical supplies, evacuate the wounded, and patrol flood-prone areas. But he received no reply. Other private citizens soon shared this idea of employing civilian aviation for national defense. In Toledo, Ohio in 1938, Milton Knight, here in the middle in 1944 as a rather salty lieutenant aboard a destroyer escort, was then in 1938 a glass company executive and an avid sportsman pilot. And he conceived of an effort to stimulate private flying for pilots interested in more than circling about airports. Together with 10 other men, he helped incorporate the Civilian Air Reserve to train private pilots for national defense purposes. Self-described as, quote, semi-military, the CAR mirrored the Army Air Corps structure with military titles and ranks. Members wore uniforms and practiced formation flying, navigation, meteorology, radio communication, aerial photography, and aircraft and engine maintenance. Should the federal government request their services, they would be ready. Although the CAR only expanded to a handful of states, it did demonstrate what volunteer civilian airmen could accomplish for national defense purposes. And with the September 1939 commencement of hostilities in Europe, voices concerned about American home defense began to contemplate if, how, or when they too might be subject to nightly visits by enemy bombers. In a February 1941 report to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, seen here on the right, himself a veteran aviator from World War I, recommended creating a home defense organization among the population and training ordinary citizens to meet the threat of air or naval attack on American cities. And on May 20th, 1941, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8757, establishing the Office of Civilian Defense, and fittingly, Roosevelt tapped LaGuardia to serve as director and tasked him with coordinating federal civilian defense activities with those of state and local governments. On June 17th, Wilson, together with Thomas H. Beck, president of the Kroll Collier Publishing Company, and Guy Gannett, president of Guy Gannett Publishing, met in New York City to draft a plan for a proposed Civil Air Defense Services, or CADS. The two primary objectives of the program would be the immediate organization of available civil air resources, and this ultimate civil development essential to any sound foundation for air power. The former sought to use civilian aviators, ineligible for military service, on a voluntary basis for national defense purposes. These civilians would be trained and organized along the lines of the Army Air Corps and provide an organized service available for use in emergencies or disasters when military aircraft and personnel were otherwise engaged. All these personnel would be volunteers, and any federal funding provided would only be used for fuel, lubrication, and maintenance. The states would thus absorb all remaining costs. Now, on this latter objective, aviation education for school children and educators would help develop and foster air-mindedness in the nation's youth, fostering the next generation of aviation professionals for civil and national defense. Now, the ideas behind this objective mirrored those of the late Brigadier General William Billy Mitchell, who in turn mirrored his ideas from those of Italian air power theorist General Giulio Douhet. Now, this three-man committee presented LaGuardia with the CADS plan on June 25th, and the cover letter of that you just saw. And LaGuardia, in turn, sent the plan to the War Department for review. Major General Henry H. Hap Arnold, seen here on the left, the Chief of the Army Air Forces, affirmed that, quote, the organization of the existing private flying resources is highly desirable from a national defense standpoint. And in mid-August, Arnold convened an informal board of Air Corps officers to study the various plans for organizing civil aviation. These included the CADS plan, the CAR, and something from the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association's group called the Air Guard. And this informal board concluded that the civilian pilots and plane owners, properly organized and trained, could potentially, quote, perform many missions, such as coastal and other patrol, tow target flying, anti-aircraft searchlight and sound detector training, transportation of personnel and supplies. And from the competing plans, the CADS proposal was deemed to be the most complete framework for a viable organization. LaGuardia then tasked his aviation aide, Reed Landis, to work with Wilson to refine this proposal, which thereafter developed into an organization to be known as Civil Air Patrol, fall of 1941. The War Department loaned Major General John F. Curry, seen here on the right, to serve as CAP's national commander. I need to pause here to mention a bit about General Curry, which is relevant to Air University. Curry's career took him from flying as part of General John J. Pershing's punitive expedition in 1916 to service in France in 1918. And from 1931 to 1935, he was commandant of the Air Corps Technical School at Maxwell Field, presiding over the faculty, which is now our university, that was then debating and refining new strategic uses of air power, which would come to fruition in the early 1940s. Curry brought to CAP a deep understanding of aviation's potential in warfare. But probably more importantly, he brought a very rich professional network of senior military leaders, which would be a benefit to CAP in its fledgling weeks and months. And on December 1st, 1941, LaGuardia placed his signature on a simplified establishment order, which you can see here on the left, which was intended for inclusion in an information booklet about CAP. But as Reed Landis explained to LaGuardia back on November 15th, in the cover memorandum for this order, the Office of Civilian Defense Staff, quote, was afraid that a long detailed order may first confuse the people in the field and secondly require so much revision as the show develops as to cause further confusion among those who will have seen the initial booklet but not completely understand the Interior Administration reasons requiring changes and ways of doing final things. So in short, this was not intended to be the finalized establishment order. Presumably, there would be lots of time to get everything squared away before any formal announcement of CAP. But unfortunately, the Imperial Japanese Navy did not get a copy of Reed Landis's memorandum. And thus, on December 8th, LaGuardia hastily initialed Office of Civilian Defense Administrative Order Number 9, seen here on the right, to legally establish CAP. That same evening, he announced CAP's existence in a national radio broadcast, and the Office of Civilian Defense issued a press release defining CAP, quote, as an organization of the civilian aviation resources of the nation for national defense service. Members and units of CAP began to materialize nationwide over the next few weeks, all looking for a mission with which to test their mettle. They didn't have to wait long. On January 12, 1942, 5 German U-boats commenced sinking merchant shipping off the eastern seaboard of North America. The German offensive, codenamed Pokenschlag, or drumbeat, delivered a jarring blow to the American home front and found the nation's military under-equipped and ill-prepared to combat the U-boat menace. Rear Admiral Adolphus Andrews, commander of the Navy's Eastern Sea Frontier, comprising almost 1,500 miles of coastline from the Canadian border with Maine to the southern boundary of Duval County, Florida, could marshal a meager force of 20 underarmed, undermanned ships and a motley assortment of 103 aircraft, 3/4 of which were unsuited for coastal patrol or anti-submarine defense. Lieutenant General Hugh A. Drum, commanding the Army's Eastern Defense Command, mustered only 100 twin-engine aircraft to patrol the entire eastern seaboard. And there was a further lack of coordination which hampered defensive efforts, with the Army and the Navy assets under the control of their respective Sea Frontier or Defensive Commander. Throughout January and February of 42, Curry began to receive letters from individuals suggesting the use of light aircraft for shore and coastal patrol operations. And this included armed patrols either over the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans. On January 23rd, Curry reported to General Arnold how, quote, "It is believed we can organize and conduct with a short time a close-in, about 10 miles, shore patrol all around the key coastal spots with great frequency per day with radio-equipped ships, thus aiding materially in providing safe waters for coastwise shipping." The next week, Curry again wrote Arnold, this time about the possible use of CAP air crews to supplement Army Air Force's operations on the Pacific coast with a close inshore patrol flying up to 15 miles off the coast to cover major shipping lanes. Now, Curry's desire for CAP to have a mission coincided with a need for additional funding to assist the wing commanders in furthering the registration of personnel, organization, and the training of CAP units. By late January, James M. Landis, who was the successor to LaGuardia as the Office of Civilian Defense Director, requested an additional $114,000 from the Bureau of the Budget for CAP, and this was at the request of Curry. But the Budget Bureau wanted additional guidance on CAP's planned activities. And when Curry attempted to get a statement from General Arnold about the Army's intention to use CAP for missions, Arnold demurred, said, "No, I'm not quite ready yet." So the Budget Bureau approached Reed Landis about CAP's functions and what jobs he believed could justify CAP organization for mission duty. One of the missions Reed Landis said CAP could accomplish was a submarine coastal patrol unit. Now, the Budget Bureau believed CAP needed to present formal evidence from the Army indicating its support and desire to use CAP. There were apparently some in the Army staff at this time who viewed CAP unfavorably. Landis apparently then reached out to Arnold, and he in turn appointed Lieutenant Colonel Gordon P. Saville, senior on the right, director of the Army Air Force's Air Defense Warning System, to work with CAP and report back to the general. When he was interviewed by the Budget Bureau, Saville explained the vicious cycle at play. CAP would not organize until the Army delegated functions, but the Army would not specify these functions until CAP organized. And Saville felt, somewhat cynically, that CAP's enlistments comprised two camps: patriots, those flyers interested in defending the United States, and amateur pilots using CAP to circumvent the Civil Aeronautics Administration restrictions simply to pursue their hobby in wartime, who just wanted to fly out of, quote, mere self-preservation. And the nation's expert on air defense, Saville saw CAP as something of, quote, a damned menace to control with, but he also thought that it could be, quote, very useful, provided its organization hews strictly to Army specifications. Now, reporting to Arnold, Saville perhaps echoed some of the air chief's concerns about crafting a working relationship between CAP and the Army. Saville saw a functioning system of both an administrative organization and a control organization. CAP would represent this administrative body with the wings and the subordinate units, while the Army would handle the control aspects, responsible for issuing orders for missions to be performed. And to provide time, though, for both organizations to establish policy and respective relationships, Saville did support the Army providing CAP funding for at least 6 months to give the organization time to mature. But during all of this same time period that he's meeting with the Budget Bureau, heavy tanker losses are gravely concerned industry and government officials. By the end of February of 42, U-boats had either damaged or destroyed 22 tankers. By the end of February, the 1st Bomber Command reported almost 8,000 hours of patrol time, but they had only 4 attacks to show for it, and no evidence of damage or destruction of the enemy. The Navy assured the American people that it had this situation under control. It claimed 21 enemy submarines damaged or sunk since December of 41. But in reality, the Navy would not destroy a U-boat until 1 March, and that one was off Newfoundland. The lack of Army and Navy coordination was leaving merchant traffic exposed and vulnerable. But one CAP pilot deeply aware of the terrible shipping losses was William D. Mason. You can see him here on the right. He was manager of Sun Oil's Marcus Hook refinery in Pennsylvania. And Mason believed CAP aircraft could fly over the shipping lanes to protect tankers and provide visible support to the uneasy morale of the tanker crews. Mason shared his views with Sun Oil's president, J. Howard Pugh. And on 3 February, Mason shared this idea about coastal patrols in a telephone conversation with General Curry. The general said he required money and he needed a directive to launch the effort. Pugh guaranteed $10,000 in funds. Curry then pursued the directive. He spoke with Lieutenant General Drum and Brigadier General Arnold N. Krogstad at 1st Bomber Command about using CAP aircraft on coastal patrol duty. Both gave Curry their informal concurrence. On February 11th, Curry met with CAP wing commanders of the eastern seaboard states in Washington, D.C. to discuss coastal patrol arrangements. Saville was at this meeting, and he addressed the group bringing a message from Arnold that, quote, the CAP would be used to the limit of its capabilities. At the end of the meeting, Curry presided over a plan for CAP to operate 2 coastal patrol bases at Atlantic City, New Jersey, and Rehoboth, Delaware. Curry then asked Arnold to use CAP for 30 days as an auxiliary force for the Army Air Force's anti-submarine patrol effort under the control of the 1st Air Support Command. And despite some Army doubts as to the effectiveness of the civilian effort, Curry did receive Army funding and approval for a 30-day experiment for the CAP bases. Upon authorization on February 28th, CAP National Headquarters immediately activated its 1st and 2nd task forces at Atlantic City and Rehoboth, respectively, with instructions from the 1st Air Support Command, quote, to establish an inshore anti-submarine patrol for the purpose of reporting the locations of enemy submarines and friendly vessels in distress. Both task forces were instructed to patrol from dawn to dusk, no more than 15 miles offshore over the Delaware and New Jersey sectors. Equipped with 2-way radios, CAP air crews would submit contact reports for any observed hostile submarines, vessels in distress, or unusual activities to Army authorities. Now, these unsophisticated CAP aircraft flying slow, low-level patrols over the ocean proved ideal for spotting small objects easily missed by high-speed military aircraft. CAP's aircraft provided a cheap and conveniently visible deterrent to U-boat surface operations. Now, aircraft in general pose the greatest threat to U-boats because of their speed, their small size, and the vulnerability of the submarine's pressure hulls to damage from explosives. U-boat doctrine entailed taking 2 actions upon spotting an aircraft during the day. If a watch crew sighted an aircraft far in the distance, then the boat would change course, reduce speed, and turn away, showing as narrow an outline as possible while minimizing its visible wake. But if an aircraft was flying directly toward a U-boat, the boat had to crash dive at once. This entailed submerging as quickly as possible and fleeing the area in case of retaliation, thereby breaking off potential attacks, burning precious fuel, and losing the opportunity and the moment of surprise. Now, also in late February of 42, following rather public attacks by Japanese and German submarines off Santa Barbara, California, and Stuart, Florida, respectively, Robert A. Lovitch, seen here on the left, Assistant Secretary of War for Air, wrote to Arnold and suggested using CAP aircraft for offshore patrols, notably painted in Army Air Corps colors and insignia to scare away submarines from critical port facilities on the east, west, and Gulf coasts. Admiral Andrews, seen here in the center, expressed the same idea, suggesting to Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King on the right, about using a, quote, scarecrow patrol of CAP aircraft in a continuous daylight patrol off the entire coast, East Coast in this case. But Andrews requested King's approval to make arrangements for this effort possible. The King, however, rejected the use of civilian aircraft for coastal patrol duty since CAP's aircraft, in his opinion, quote, would not be productive in sufficient degree to compensate for the operational difficulties to be encountered in coordinating and controlling the flying involved by inexperienced personnel. But the Army, however, sought expansion since CAP's coastal patrol bases could conveniently replace military units needed for operations either domestically or, more importantly, overseas. And in late March of 42, Andrews received operational control of elements of 1st Bomber Command, 1st Air Support Command, and all of the CAP Coastal Patrol units. He essentially got his Scarecrow Patrol. And concurrently, in late March, early April, representatives from the Bureau of the Budget interviewed Andrews and the Army representatives for their personal views on the CAP Coastal Patrol effort. And Andrews encouraged the use of CAP by the Army, and he said this civilian effort provided valuable intelligence. Even unarmed, the CAP served effectively as the Scarecrow Patrol, and the use of CAP aircraft should be continued until military forces can take over the job. Notably, Andrews told the Bureau representatives that, quote, the CAP has so far exercised fully adequate control and discipline of its members. Two officers from 1st Air Support Command, Lieutenant Colonel John P. Doyle and Lieutenant Colonel John E. Brodel, spoke at length about the Coastal Patrol effort. Both of these men thought a great need existed for using CAP due to military necessity and that of the organization's deterrent usage. And this, they said, was its greatest value. They concluded, the greater the number of eyes we have in the sky, the fewer sinkings we are going to have. They noted that CAP, quote, had not failed in a single instance to fully accomplish all missions assigned, and had experienced no dereliction or deficiency in the performance of duty. These men, understandably, supported continuing CAP civilian effort. And like Andrews, they felt CAP should remain a civilian effort. Because CAP employed pilots who, quote, cannot possibly meet military standards and therefore cannot be recruited in the Navy or Army as pilots, CAP units were freeing up military personnel for service elsewhere. Now, this actual Scarecrow Patrol would slowly emerge between spring and summer. In May, the War Department transferred $160,000 to the Office of Civilian Defense to help fund bases in Florida, Georgia, and Virginia. With an estimated monthly base cost at only $20,000 for 12 to 15 aircraft, the Army funds were providing for personnel per diem and reimbursements for hourly aircraft operational costs. But all the other funds for these bases had to come from the individual CAP members themselves, whatever these bases could beg, borrow, or requisition. And CAP faced a steep learning curve for anti-submarine operations, and they ended up drawing from some of their best wings, aircraft, and personnel. These bases typically numbered from 55 to 76 personnel, with 15 pilots and observers respectively, and at least 15 aircraft flying a daily average of 40 hours. The pilots had to have a minimum of 200 flying hours, and both pilots and observers required a practical working knowledge of air navigation. The actual aircraft the patrol used represented a mix of nearly 24 different manufacturers and 10 engine types of at least 90 horsepower. Well over half of these were either the Stinson Voyager 10A on the right or the Fairchild Model 24 on the left. The former cruised at 108 miles an hour with 330-mile range, while the latter, which technically can seat 4 people, cruised at 103 miles per hour with a range of 525 miles. And all of these first patrols are almost entirely improvised affairs. This is trial and error. The procedures and the profiles for the Coastal Patrol missions would eventually emerge in time. For the most part, they consisted of 2-ship formations with 2-man crews, pilot and observers, flying from dawn to dusk at altitudes ranging from a few hundred to perhaps a few thousand feet above the waves for hours at a time, up to 15 miles offshore. Instruction for the air crews came internally, either from among task force personnel or from civilian aviation experts. Eventually, in 43, these bases would receive formal anti-submarine warfare training materials from the Army and the Navy. With the commencement of coastal convoys by the Navy in May of 1942, CAP bases began receiving tasking orders for convoy escort from the respective sea frontiers. But at this point, with easy targets no longer available on the East Coast, German U-boats shifted their operations southward along the Florida coast, the Caribbean, and into the Gulf of Mexico, where aerial defenses were in short supply. And it was in that month that U-boat attacks rose sharply, and losses in the Gulf Sea frontier, which is largely the Gulf of Mexico and the other parts of Florida, doubled those of the Eastern Sea frontier. And the southward movement of the U-boat offensive contributed to the arming of CAP Coastal Patrol aircraft. I'm going to offer up an example here from history. Not that this whole talk isn't that. In the first week of May of 42, there were 3 German U-boats, U-109, U-33, and U-564, which were operating off Florida, right near the 3rd Task Force located at Morrison Field, West Palm Beach. Over this first week in May, the CAP patrols found themselves locating sinking ships and spotting survivors in the water on an almost daily basis. On May 4th, 3 aircraft reported sighting a submerged submarine. This may actually have been U-564, stalking a tanker. The aircraft dove on the periscope, what they thought was the periscope, and the submarine appeared to dive and break off its attack. And First Ground Air Support Command sent commendations to the air crews, and in their opinion, they helped save this tanker. Then around dusk on May 6th, a CAP aircraft reported sighting a U-boat just off Cape Canaveral having run aground in shallow water. This may be U-109. The men radioed for help for about 30-40 minutes, but no help arrived until well after the boat had vanished. In response to this, Arnold ordered 1st Air Force to arm CAP with 100-pound bombs, and the patrols received new guidance, quote, to take all action within their means to destroy any enemy sighted. Now, the Army's decision here to arm and empower CAP air crews demonstrated a growing trust in the civilian organization and a sense of urgency in staunching merchant shipping losses. CAP now faced the challenge of conducting and sustaining patrol operations with the added responsibility of carrying armament and maintaining both the personnel and the aircraft bearing the explosive burden. National Headquarters subsequently issued corrective actions to increase its military character to measure up to its new responsibilities. All the volunteers serving on Coastal Patrol task forces were required to execute an active duty oath, which is a variant on the same oath executed by military officers. By July, the War Department authorized all CAP members to wear regular Army uniforms with certain distinguishing features, particularly a new shoulder sleeve insignia sporting U.S. to ensure treatment as belligerents under international law, as well as garish red shoulder loops. Army funding facilitated CAP activation of additional Coastal Patrol bases to provide coverage in the entire Gulf Sea frontier. By late September 1942, CAP could claim 21 Coastal Patrol bases, providing inshore daytime aerial Coastal Patrol coverage from Maine to Mexico. And by then, CAP's Coastal Patrol growth had overwhelmed the previous supervisory abilities of 1st Ground Air Support Command. But thankfully, the activation in October 1942 of the Army Air Force's Anti-Submarine Command, or AFAC, provided CAP with greater guidance to standardize and professionalize operations on par with the Army and Navy procedures. By now, all these Coastal Patrol bases would maintain 2 aircraft with combat crews on alert during daylight hours for on-command missions. Patrols would also be limited to no more than 60 miles offshore. And convoy escort missions received specific maneuver instructions for improved coverage of the vessels themselves. But all these new mission requirements strained CAP's available resources to maintain the bases and the operational readiness of its diverse fleet of aircraft. Aircraft maintenance at earlier bases varied in quality, but the newer bases often faced poor or non-existent facilities, trouble in acquiring parts, and insufficient equipment and personnel for aircraft repair and upkeep. Searching for spare parts to service an array of airframes and engines, as you can imagine, proved almost as difficult as spotting submarines. The bases frequently had to wait 4 to 6 weeks for reimbursement vouchers to arrive from the Treasury Department. And until funds arrived, personal bank accounts often had to suffice to cover repairs. So creativity and interpersonal connections proved invaluable in keeping planes operational when proper supply channels failed to produce results. At Base 7 in Miami, mechanics would cut the bottoms off beer cans to make a substitute for the rubber wind cone for radio antenna. At Grand Isle, Louisiana at Base 9, mechanics made baffles out of an old Coca-Cola sign. They'd make exhaust stacks from oil drums and aircraft covering out of bed sheets and pillowcases, as well as antenna weights from toilet plungers. Base 9 also had a problem in that they didn't have a hangar for a while, and they didn't have barbed wire to surround the aircraft, and cattle grazing on the island would actually come and eat the fabric off the aircraft. I kid you not. Aircraft cannibalization then, particularly at Base 9, provided occasional solutions for problems, except for when they ran into a situation where they had a plane with 2 different wings from 2 different aircraft, each sporting a different N number. But from the early months of the Coastal Patrol effort, the Civil Aeronautics Board was conducting inspections of all these bases. And the inspectors reported on the airfields themselves, the personnel, the aircraft operations, as well as maintenance. And they found, unsurprisingly, that base maintenance and supply varied. One investigator at Base 8 in Charleston, South Carolina, found this unit in possession of a, quote, well-equipped maintenance and overhaul department, which was better supplied with motor parts and supplied than any base they had investigated. By comparison, an investigator at Base 21 in Beaufort, North Carolina, which was the last Coastal Patrol base activated, wrote that, quote, considering the lack of proper equipment and the limited facilities available, it is quite remarkable that this base is able to carry on operations at all. The investigator further admitted, quote, The hazardous nature of the operations carried out by the CAP pilots and observers in a very patriotic endeavor causes the CAA inspector to overlook violations of certain civil air regulations which would not be tolerated in any other type of civil flying. At this point, aircrew fatigue is also a problem. One investigator documented pilots at bases in Texas recording almost 54 hours and 41 hours of patrol time over 12 and 7 days, respectively. And without any formal regulations on crew rest, the CAP air crews flew a rather impressive 82,829 patrol hours just in October. Now, most likely, because of the Civil Aeronautics Administration findings, CAP National Headquarters encouraged Coastal Patrol commanding officers to appoint flight surgeons for semi-monthly inspection of the health and the fitness of base personnel. National Headquarters also established a required 1 day of crew rest per week for the Coastal Patrol aircrew, and they later modified this in November with an additional 2 days of rest per month. Now, I have to give a shout out here to the Army and the Navy. They weren't required to do this, but they were very sympathetic of the CAP Coastal Patrol operations and the work they were doing. They would often go out of their way to help the bases provide equipment. They would repair dangerously worn out aircraft. They provide life-saving equipment. There were several instances where they completely overhauled and repainted worn out aircraft, as you can see in the upper left, in three-tone US Navy camouflage. Now, the breaking point came in November of 1942. The CAP National Headquarters then reported high morale, but they had serious difficulties securing aircraft parts and other materials for operations. Now, after having only suffered one fatality in July, 9 CAP Coastal Patrol aircrew died in accidents and crashes from October to December. CAP was unable to obtain a certificate of military necessity to obtain parts and maintenance, and CAP National Headquarters then informed the Army of its intention in early November to immediately dissolve its Coastal Patrol operation. The Army was not prepared for this, but decreased enemy submarine activity gave them sufficient rationale to instead reduce CAP Coastal Patrol operations to give it time to decide its ultimate future. To curtail profitless flying during this period of negligible enemy activity, both the Army and the Navy ordered CAP to reduce its Coastal Patrol flying and instead focus its efforts on training for personnel, as well as the maintenance of aircraft and base facilities. In mid-December, Admiral King directed his Gulf and Eastern Sea Frontier commanders to curtail CAP operations by at least 30% over the next 3 months, with additional 1/3 reductions planned for March and June of 43 to conclude this entire effort by August. But meanwhile, the Army and the Office of Civilian Defense had entered into discussions in early 43 to transfer CAP to the War Department. Secretary Lovitch, who was a big supporter of CAP's Coastal Patrol, suggested to Landis that this could provide a possible solution to CAP's operational struggles. A transfer would enable the provision of the equipment and supplies for CAP's current as well as future operations, and it made greater sense considering that the Army Air Forces were already paying 95% of CAP's operational costs. Landis was very hesitant to let go of essentially one of the Office of Civilian Defense's crown jewels, and he asked for a reasonable assurance from Lovitch that CAP's civilian character would be fostered and cared for by the Army. And in response to this, Lovitch wrote, quote, "I can only answer this by saying that it is our intention to continue to make use of CAP in every field where the expense in men, money, and materials is justified as a part of the overall war effort, including in that objective the importance of increasing the flying experience of a large number of civilians and stimulating and developing interest in aviation among all our citizens, particularly younger men." To this, Landis raised no objection. And consequently, President Roosevelt will issue Executive Order 9339 on April 29, 1943, transferring CAP to the War Department. On that day, CAP reported having 1,683 personnel and 423 aircraft assigned to Coastal Patrol duty. In connection with the executive order, Lovitch wrote Landis, that letter is there on the left, acknowledging this transfer as, quote, "recognition of a job well done, motivated by a desire to make the Civil Air Patrol more directly available to perform its services to the armed forces." And Landis admitted he, quote, "hated to say goodbye to the Civil Air Patrol, purely from a personal standpoint, as I have developed an affection for many of the men who sweated it out." Mind you, the next paragraph, he also says, "and I like the ability to hitch a ride in, short notice." Now, the availability of aircraft parts and maintenance notably improved with this transfer to the War Department, but unfortunately, the majority of the previously unavailable Army material would not reach the Coastal Patrol effort because the day after CAP's transfer to the War Department, Admiral King directed the Eastern and Gulf Sea Frontier commanders to relieve and replace all CAP Coastal Patrol units with military personnel and aircraft by August 31st. The Army Air Forces replied then in mid-May that they had no objection to closing the CAP Coastal Patrol, and the civilian effort quietly ceased at sundown on August 31st. Statistically speaking, from March of 42 to August of 43, CAP flew 86,685 Coastal Patrol missions, totaling 244,600 flight hours. Air crews reported sighting 91 vessels in distress, 173 suspected submarines, 36 dead bodies, 17 floating mines, as well as 363 survivors of attacks. At the request of the Navy, CAP also conducted 5,684 special convoy escort missions. Most notably, from the period of 1 October 1942 to 31 August 43, this is when U-boats were operating in the North Atlantic, Army Air Force's Anti-Submarine Command recorded 375,269 hours of anti-submarine operational flying. CAP alone accounted for approximately 52.4% of that. Now, originally a skeptic, Admiral King commended the work of the CAP Coastal Patrol on August 11, 43, expressing a well done for their enthusiastic, loyal, and constant cooperation in the performance of its mission. General Arnold, one of CAP's biggest proponents, reflected on the value and impressive accomplishments of the Coastal Patrol to both CAP and the nation in a speech of December 16, 1944. Quote, "The Civil Air Patrol patrolled our shores and performed its anti-submarine work at a time of almost desperate national crisis. If it had done nothing beyond this, the Civil Air Patrol would have earned an honorable place in the history of American air power." The success of the Coastal Patrol, begun as an experiment, ensured the success of a much grander experiment, being the entirety of CAP. A small cadre of Coastal Patrol members proved the essential vanguard to convince Army leadership of CAP's capacity to become a semi-military auxiliary, able to supplement and replace military units needed elsewhere. Civilian volunteers demonstrated sufficient competency and professionalism for the military to equip and entrust CAP members with weapons and release authority to use deadly force against lawful combatants. Furthermore, the civilian effort, with minimal military guidance, managed to organize, equip, and operate 21 independent air bases, providing a stopgap measure when the nation's armed forces lacked the assets to deter and constrain enemy submarine operations. With this motley assortment of low-technology aircraft, CAP integrated with increasingly sophisticated military assets. Together, this civil-military aerial umbrella safely escorted thousands of American and Allied merchant ships and their crews along the nation's coastlines, enabling safe passage to ports in the European and Pacific theaters of war. Granted, amidst CAP successes can be found considerable shortcomings. As with many military operations, logistical issues proved problematic. A diverse fleet of airframes and engines, together with limited parts, maintenance facilities, and personnel, resulted in dangerous aircraft flown by tired crews. Considering the long daily overwater patrols with inadequate survival equipment and ordnance-trained airframes, it is either a miracle or a testament to American aeronautical engineering that CAP lost only 90 aircraft, with 26 personnel killed and 7 seriously injured during the 18 months of operations. Arguably, greater initial investment in CAP's Coastal Patrol effort from the Army may have altered U-boat operations off the East and Gulf coasts. Recognizing the monthly cost to operate a CAP Coastal Patrol base, about $20,000, versus the purchase of a single B-24 heavy bomber, which was approximately $297,000, a modicum of additional War Department funding could have placed more CAP aircraft on Coastal Patrol in areas of high U-boat traffic during the critical period of April to June 42. This argument in particular applies to the Gulf Coast states, where hastily erected CAP bases and coastal patrols would have provided air coverage of tankers sailing off the Louisiana coast. Regardless of being armed or not, the deterrent scarecrow element of CAP played a factor in pushing the U-boat threat away from the nation's coastline. The untold number of men, ships, and war material that safely left American factories to defeat the forces of the Axis owed CAP a debt of protective gratitude of dollars, lives, and months of bloody fighting saved. CAP's Coastal Patrol experience is a noteworthy success story in the history of American civil-military relations. Volunteers possessed of genuine loyalty and devotion to duty flew their aircraft to the point of critical failure and took considerable risk in service to the military and the public. Ironically, at the point when the CAP Coastal Patrol effort had its most competent personnel, along with Army administration and logistical agreements to more adequately maintain its aircraft and bases, the tides of war had turned in the Battle of the Atlantic, negating the need for this aspect of CAP services. But the War Department nonetheless recognized CAP as a proven partner in the defense of the home front. In August 1944, the War Department issued a memorandum clarifying CAP's exact status. Under the signatures of Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, the memorandum stated that, quote, Civil Air Patrol, an auxiliary of the Army Air Forces, is an official Army Air Forces agency. And in September of that year, Arnold chose to modify CAP's uniformed appearance to further conform with the Army. He recommended replacing the Office of Civilian Defense required red shoulder loops and sleeve braid. The commanding general opted for this because now that CAP was under his supervision and performed services on behalf of the country and the Army, the red shoulder loops and sleeve braid, quote, did not properly represent the relationship between the civilian volunteers and the Army Air Forces. This civil-military relationship embodied in the Coastal Patrol effort is a critical factor in CAP's post-war survival. Incorporated in 1946 and established as a civilian auxiliary of the U.S. Air Force in 1948, today CAP volunteers work alongside uniformed Air Force personnel in a number of missions, from search and rescue to unmanned aircraft escorts to air intercept training. In an era of budget uncertainty and limited resources, the Air Force is the only major service that has a doctrinally integrated civilian auxiliary. Much as World War II's Coastal Patrol delivered a valuable asset for minimal outlay, today's CAP members provide a 4-to-1 return on investment, enabling the Air Force to increase training and liberate assets for deployment and greater operational use elsewhere. Operating one of the largest fleets of single-engine aircraft in the world in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia, the Air Force has an operational and civil-military relations resource unlike any of the other uniformed services. And since March 2020, CAP has found itself engaged in its largest continuous operation since World War II, responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. With quiet professionalism, CAP's first year of COVID-19 response resulted in the deliveries of over 8.2 million meals, 1.1 million pounds of food, 2.6 million face masks, and countless test kits, test samples, and vials of vaccine. When members are not engaged in COVID-19 response, they are participating in emergency management operations. They're educating the nation's youth on aerospace and introducing them to flight, and preparing the next generation of servant leaders in our armed forces and society. CAP has come a long way since the first ideas circulated of placing light aircraft out over the ocean to deter enemy submarines. But thanks to the men and women of the Coastal Patrol, CAP survived the war to become one of our nation's premier service organizations. I thank you all for your attention, and I leave you with this ridiculous photo of me sunburned at the World War II weekend in Reading, Pennsylvania. My friend there, Sean Neal, and we're in front of his restored Fairchild Model 24, which did fly Coastal Patrol duty during World War II. I will exit my slides, I will turn on my camera, and I will take any questions that you all may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blazich, for that. I know that the rest of us, and I'm very appreciative of you for doing that. Before we open it up to the questions, and I will review the ones that are in the chat first, I would like to just inform the participants and the attendees today that this session is recorded and that it will be available on the library stream services for folks that are at Air University. If you are not an Air University participant and would like to have a link to this recording, if you would just put your email in the chat, and we'll make sure that that gets sent back to you. So let me just start, just before we go to the newest question, sir, here you did address it, but let me just review it to see if you had anything else to say about it. There was a question earlier that asked, where did the Air Patrol get the bombs to blow up the U-boats? And I believe you addressed it, but would you like to say anything else about that?
I'd be happy to. So ordnance came both from the U.S. Army as well as the United States Navy. In this case, the Navy would provide the Mark 17 depth bombs. These are 325-pound depth bombs, which only a handful of the aircraft could carry those. The 100 and 210-pound general purpose demolition bombs came from the United States Army, and only Army personnel were actually authorized to handle the ordnance and install the ordnance on the aircraft, although the CAP air crews would have to remove the safing pins from the fuses prior to their mission, as well as reinsert them, and they did have release authority to use the ordnance. I see one there about, did we sink any U-boats? And for those who know me, you're hopefully chuckling on the other side of the screen. No, we did not sink any. We did not sink any German U-boats. If you obtain a copy of this book from Air University Press, I think I put it in Appendix G, and it took me about 7 years of research to really figure it out. But long story short, CAP air crews, whatever they saw, whatever they reported, they would bring this information back to the base. The base would tabulate the information, and once a week, they would send it by teletypewriter to CAP National Headquarters, first in Washington and later in New York City. This information, once compiled, was provided to the Army and the Navy. If CAP members said, we saw something, we dropped bombs on it, it went away, we think we hit a sub, that was reported. Now, any attack reported by civil air patrol, meaning we actually dropped ordnance, these were logged by the US military and investigated. The US military never did investigate all these. They did take this seriously. They found no evidence we ever hit anything or damaged anything or much less sank anything. But the CAP reports, what we were saying internally, our crews said, we think we sank something and we think we hit something. Those were reported to headquarters, and that's what we reported to the military. In 1942 and 43, with the war on Oak still going on, there was potential sense there that, yes, maybe we did do this. But after the war in 1945, when we had access to the Kriegsmarine records, particularly those of the U-boat arm, Allied forces went back and tried to compare, saying, well, 1,163 U-boats, what became of all of them? In that case, none of the claims were ever attributed to CAP. And I dug into the German records, I dug into the American records, I was in the National Archives. I simply didn't find anything. The key element to remember is our job, while we in theory could sink a sub, our job was really to keep the subs from sinking the merchant ships and sinking other Allied shipping. That we accomplished undeniably. And at the end of the day, that's statistically more important than sinking the subs. That's a very long-winded answer, and I apologize, but I hope it helps.
Well, that sounds great. We have another comment, a question. Dr. Lovitch, can you please tell others about your CAP experience so others can consider joining?
Oh my goodness. Okay. So my background with joining Civil Air Patrol dates to 2010, when I was working on my Ph.D. research about, unsurprisingly, civil defense. And I was approached by a CAP member saying, do you ever find information about the Civil Air Patrol in the archives? And I said, well, yes, but it's not my area of focus. It's not what I'm interested in. And then one day, while down in the North Carolina State Archives in Raleigh, I came upon all the records of the origin of the North Carolina wing of CAP, as well as Coastal Patrol bases 16 at Manteo, North Carolina, and 21 at Beaufort, North Carolina. And I shared these with this member, and they said, we don't know any of this. Like, nobody knows about this. This is how do you do this? It's like, well, it's my job. And long story short, I was funneling records to this person. And I said, well, why don't I just join CAP? It makes a lot more sense to be inside the organization, part of the organization, sharing this story. A member then put me in touch with folks of the Ohio wing. I was in Columbus, Ohio at the time. I went to the headquarters, introduced myself, chatted with everybody, and said, it's a good bunch of men and women. I think I'd like to be part of them. That's how I joined. And that was October 26, 2011. So I just celebrated 10 years of being a CAP member. I've been doing history for CAP ever since. And if you'd like to join me on the history side of the house, send me an email. I'd love to talk to you.
We have another question that's come up. And do you have biographical info on those who were killed?
We do have yes and no. We do have information on some of the fallen. A friend of mine and fellow member of the National History Program staff, Lieutenant Colonel Seth Hudson, has been actively researching all the CAP fallen from World War II to the present in our latest issue of Volunteer Magazine, which you can find at cap.news. And I know its editor-in-chief here, some R. Bollinger, which I'm going to call out in the chat. Our feature article is actually about a handful of the fallen. In terms of the Coastal Patrol fallen, I do not have complete bios on all of them. I do have biographical information on some of them. And if that's information you would like, please let me know. The biggest challenge, and I talk about it in the introduction to the book, really the biggest challenge with this story is the lack of records. A lot of information, because CAP was semi-military, not an outright military government organization, the records are kind of scattered to the winds. And every so often a new item will pop out of the ground. I had even documents donated to CAP after the book was published in December 2020 that, quite honestly, I wish I had known about. I would have used them in the book because they're so fascinating with the argument and shows the foresight that CAP had of how they will be useful to the United States Army and the U.S. Navy and the anti-submarine effort. So if you do have information, I think it's Jack Goble here. Jack, if you have information, shoot me a message. I'd love to talk. And if you're looking for someone in particular, please let me know, because every piece we can pull back in to help put the story together is going to make it that much stronger moving forward.
Okay, we have just a couple more minutes. There's another question. How is the CAP uniform regulated? Does it have its own awards and decorations?
Yes. So I talk about, I know, shameless self-promotion. I talk about in the book to some extent how CAP eventually was authorized wear of the military uniform. Now, the CAP today as kind of an independent nonprofit corporation, we wear the Air Force uniform, and the governance of that is controlled by the U.S. Air Force itself, as well as federal policy. We wear it, however, with distinctive insignia and distinctive, excuse me, my brain's freezing up here. Distinctive gray shoulder sleeves for the shoulder loops, as well as distinctive badges and our own distinctive ribbons. That insignia is controlled both with Air Force oversight, but particularly by the corporation itself. And if you look up CAP regulation, which we all have to know, 39-1, as well as CAP regulation 39-3, which you can find at our website, gocivilairpatrol.com, you can find all the particulars about the governance of the uniform and all the different insignia, badges of rank, and so forth and so on.
Well, that's perfect. And I believe, sir, this may be the final question. At what point were women allowed to fly or work with the CAP?
Women were authorized to join CAP and be active members from its onset in December of 1941. And CAP made a point under General Curry in mid-December of 41 saying, look, we do not discriminate on race, we do not discriminate on sex, we do not discriminate on age, religion, national origin. And if you want to join CAP, we'd love to have you. They did, however, deny women the opportunity to fly on the Coastal Patrol missions. The exact reasoning on this is not clear. It's not set in the records. They simply said, well, women can't fly. Part of it, kind of reading between the lines, they argued that women would not have sufficient strength if the aircraft went down in the ocean to get out of the aircraft in time and to save themselves. Now, this is malarkey, but that was unfortunately the rationale at the time. Mind you, the Women's Air Force Service pilots are going to come along in 42, 43, 44 at the same time and clearly demonstrate that the women have no problem controlling high-performance military aircraft and much less extricating themselves in difficult situations. But CAP denied women the Coastal Patrol opportunity. They did, however, allow them to fly courier missions and other forest missions, missing aircraft search missions, and so forth. And Margaret J. Bartholomew of the Ohio Wing, as the one CAP female who was killed on active service during World War II. She was ferrying an aircraft and unfortunately flew into a thunderstorm caught up with her, and she was crashed and went down with the aircraft. And so women have been an active part of CAP both during the war and all the way to the present. And it's it's one of the major attributes of CAP is that we have embraced diversity and embraced the contributions of anyone interested in aviation from day one.
Okay, well, thank you, sir. And I believe that we've reached the end of today's session. Once again, I want to thank our speaker, Dr. Lovitch, and I also want to thank the numerous folks at the Air University Library that helped put this together. There's several that worked on the technical aspects and try to keep me straight as well. And also to thank the Air University Press for their support as well. So with that, I will say have a good day and thank you again.